what sparked the show to begin with. I mean, this was a show that got created from Corrina really coming to us. And a lot of our shows aren't created that way. I mean, sometimes we'll reach out to people and say, hey, we have an idea. We think you'd be a good fit for this theme of a show. Is that something you want to explore? And then in this case, the reverse happened. Corrina's like, hey, I have an idea and I'm interested to explore that with you guys. What do you think?
This is Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we'll explore how podcasting can drive your company's content strategy, build brand awareness, and help you connect with your ideal customers. Let's get to it.
Hey, I'm Justin. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. We produce a lot of shows at Motion. We have close to 60 shows either in development or in production right now. And with each show we launch and run, we always learn something new. So in this episode, we continue our Build in Public series. And I sit down with my business partner, Tristan Pelligrino, to uncover some of the unique things we learned while launching Direct with Corrina and Taylor, a new show that's part of Motion's network of shows that features co-hosts Corrina Owens and Taylor Young. All right. So as we jump into it, I think something that would be good for the audience is just to understand the theme around Direct with Corrina and Taylor.
Yeah. Probably the best way to do that is I'll just read the theme statement. And the theme statement is something that we actually produce for every show, whether that's a client show or whether that's for one of our own shows. So we work with folks that are spearheading the podcast and trying to figure out what exactly is the theme. Essentially, that is who is the podcast for and how does it help. So here's the Direct with Corrina and Taylor theme statement. Direct with Corrina and Taylor is a podcast for go-to-market professionals who want to see how work really gets done. In each episode, Corrina and Taylor capture stories from individual contributors on go-to-market teams. These are the people who roll up their sleeves and make campaigns happen. Ultimately, the stories and experiences shared by guests will help inspire your next project and unlock the next step in your career. So with that theme statement, I mean, what comes to mind for you? How does that resonate with you?
Yeah. So I think we were actually having this conversation recently about another show that we're launching within our network. But I just love the idea of learning from the people who are in the weeds and actually doing the work. It's something that you and I on this show for years have tried to highlight, which is not just the host of some podcast that is, has good visibility or that is well known within the space. We all know those people, but we've always tried to uncover the person behind the person. Some marketer who's running 3 podcasts at an organization and isn't ever seen or heard from, and we actually had to go find this person and say, hey, who's behind this company's shows? And that's one of the things that I love about this show is trying to find the people who are maybe not getting the recognition. And even after episode 1, their episode with Amber from User Gems, I even know Trinity from User Gems. I don't know Amber. I've seen Trinity around. I think we first spoke to her for a variety. I think we had her on our podcast, on our first podcast years ago. And so it was just very cool that their first guest was someone from an organization where there is a relatively popular name or person on social media, more the executive. I think she's Amber's boss, but we had Amber on, the person who's really running those initiatives at the organization. And so for me, it's just something that I've always liked. We work with influencers. We work with people who are very visible, including the 2 people on this show. But I've always loved when somebody goes out of their way to highlight the people who are doing the work, because in many cases, those are the people who you're really going to learn from.
Yeah. And you're talking about like doing the work. And I think if we think about who's involved with this show, we have Corrina Owens, Taylor Young. The interesting thing here is that they've actually done the work together. And I think that's an interesting dynamic that we can talk about, that I'm excited about, because they've been in the weeds, like you said, and I think they'll be able to draw from from some of those experiences with the other individual contributors that they're going to bring on. I mean, what do you think about that as far as like this dynamic duo that we have so far?
Yeah, I think it really lends to there really is that like combination of types of hosts. You have the host who, and we've seen it, right? With many of our shows where marketers are hosting podcasts that are not in marketing, and they have to serve more as that reporter or person who's there to ask questions, but maybe not lend
Yeah.
too much of their own expertise because they really don't have it. One of our clients and someone who we just really like is Joe Michalowski of Mosaic, or Mosaic.tech. And, Joe is historically a copywriter, content marketer, worked for Animals, now works at Mosaic, and he hosts the podcast. And I believe he's interviewed people like the CFO of Peloton. I don't know in those conversations if Joe's really going to be able to lend his own expertise as a marketer. It's a fintech financial podcast. But in these situations, it is very exciting, and I think it can provide unique conversation when the people really have done the work. And I think you and I have talked about that over the years, which is you can either listen to podcasts or just hear from people, and you can tell when they've done the work or not. I don't want to say one is better than the other. I think they both serve their purpose, and a lot of times are dictated by necessity. If you work with marketing on a non-marketing podcast, it's going to operate with more velocity. You have more autonomy. There's a lot of benefits there, but it is a lot of fun when you have that show where the hosts really lend their expertise. So I'm excited about it. I'm excited to see where this show goes, and how the two of them can evolve as co-hosts to not only play off of each other, but also off of guests from the experiences that they have.
Yeah, and the interesting dynamic here is Corrina and Taylor worked together before, but now they're not at the same organization. So I think we get to hear about some of their shared experiences when they were working together on projects, but then it's also like, oh, we've gone our separate paths into two different companies. What has Taylor learned over here? And then what has Corrina learned in a slightly different way? And then how does all that come back with the guests? So there's like a couple different layers there that we don't really have with any of our other shows that I think will be interesting to explore there.
And it even makes me think about, just for the audience, we went to a company happy hour last night. And it was really cool because some of the people who are here with us over these couple of days were filming in our office. That's how we're filming and recording this podcast. But there were like these layers of how people knew each other over the years, where at Tristan's first agency, he worked with the two members of the crew. Then Tristan and I worked together at that agency after those guys, and now we're here doing additional things with new members of the staff. And I think, hearing about those shared experiences, where the overlap was, what people did not only together, and some of those fun stories that we shared last night at dinner, and then hearing stories from other folks, I think that it could and has the potential to really lend to a lot of fun for the show. And it's something that co-hosting isn't for everybody. It can be difficult to find that perfect blend of interviewing versus like having genuine rapport.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see how they're able to play that off of each other.
Yeah, and I think that takes a little bit of time too. So like how we see them interact in the early episodes will probably change down the line. One thing I wanted to ask about is get your thoughts on is with the individual contributors that will be highlighted on this show. How will that help, I think, our ideal customers? Like why do we want this show to be a part of our network? How is direct going to impact some of the challenges that our customers are going through?
Yeah, I mean, there's a variety of ways, and it really depends on which business units you're looking at. But I think, one of the things that you and I really like with our shows is when we can hear from people who, like I mentioned before, are doing the work. Not talking necessarily always about like ideologies or like high level tactics, but actually breaking things down and providing content that helps.
Yeah.
I was in this office today, and while we're conducting these interviews, and I overheard you and Rob is one of our other shows for On Camera, On Brand, and just continuing to really drill into how can these shows help people? How can they listen to something and then have takeaways in their job? And a lot of the content that I see out there typically, or not typically, that's not fair to the content creators. I think sometimes I see things and I read them and I'm like, it's an interesting philosophy, but how? And I just really like the idea of drilling into the people who are individual contributors, not the people who maybe just received the acclaim for a successful campaign that worked. And they're like, hey, we rolled this thing out and it was so successful. But really, what was the wiring to make that happen? So I guess from your perspective, same question, what are you most excited about what this show can bring to this B2B marketer, small, scrappy, likely in tech audience that we're trying to build across all of these shows?
Yeah, I think I'd probably go back to what sparked the show to begin with. I mean, this was a show that got created from Corrina really coming to us. And a lot of our shows aren't created that way. I mean, sometimes we'll reach out to people and say, hey, we have an idea. We think you'd be a good fit for this theme of a show. Is that something you want to explore? And then in this case, the reverse happened. Corrina's like, hey, I have an idea and I'm interested to explore that with you guys. What do you think? So we jumped on a phone call, broke it down. And what interested me was when Corrina mentioned how a lot of these podcasts in tech, you get this cycle of the same folks that are appearing on each episode, right? We got the same 10, 20 people in a specific subject matter area. They're appearing on every podcast that you have. And it's like, well, we keep hearing the same conversations over and over again. So how do we figure out what's really working or what is the real work that's being done? You have to go, into the details, and you got to get the individual contributors. These are the folks that are actually making things happen within their companies. And that's really what appealed to me there. So we hopefully will see some different faces that are involved with this particular podcast here.
And it's something you and I talk about all the time when we're actually talking about it's no secret if you listen to this show, our segment is the B2B marketer in tech, small scrappy team. And when we are talking about wanting to generate business for ourselves, those are the people that we're always talking about. We know that we can talk to the people who you see on LinkedIn all the time, but that is like a microcosm 1% of 1% of B2B tech marketers out in the world actually doing the job. And those are the people who not only do we want to hear from, but we also want to get in front of. And it's very difficult because so many people out there are not influencers or visible or are more that
lurker.
Thank you.
Sorry. We'll put that in the big graphic.
A lurker. And being able to target those people from a demand gen perspective is always something that we're talking about. And those are also the people that I want to hear from. I want to hear from the people who have their heads down and are running campaigns, and I've already used the term, but who are in the weeds, who may or may not have time to be on LinkedIn, or maybe it's just not a priority for them, but it doesn't mean that they're not doing great marketing. It just may not be as important to them, that aspect of it, but it doesn't mean that they're not worth hearing from, trying to get in front of, what have you. So, that is, and will continue to be something that we have a big focus on here, because it's not just all about hearing from the same voices.
Yeah. And, kind of with that philosophy in mind and this co-host dynamic that we had, or that we have with this show, I think that gave us an opportunity to do something a little different with the look and feel, which we could probably move into next with this show. It's something that we did for the first time, which was we actually, in order to get to the end state of where we are, we actually use Midjourney to help with the brainstorming piece of it. Because, and I'll get into how that worked in a second, but one of the things that's unique about the shows that we create, we're literally starting with a blank canvas, right? Because all of these shows can take on a brand of its own. It's not like we're tying all of the visual elements back to Motion's brand.
Or to a company's brand, for that
to
matter.
a company's brand, yeah.
Talk a little bit about the different, and I think this would be good for the audience, the difference between, so when we launch a podcast for a company,
Yeah.
typically building sub-brand, using their brand guidelines, what have you, and with these shows within the Motion network of shows, soon to be Marketers in Demand, they're all custom. I mean, we're starting from, there's no, you don't talk to a person and you're like, so what are your brand guidelines? Now, maybe some big time influencers, you've got Dave Gerhardt, who's got Exit 5, and it has its branding on what have you.
Still, that's tied to something,
it's tied to it in an entity. And so in these situations, you have Corrina, which you mentioned before, which is, I want to just tell the audience, it is very cool to, early on when we were doing this, I mean, we were tapping people on the shoulders, begging them to trust us with their personal brands. Hey, we're going to do this podcast for you. Just like, we have this vision and, are you willing to put in some work with us?
Now we've evolved.
And they're like, I have no idea who you are. And I'm like, well, I've been following you for a year and a half. Yeah. And then to go from that perspective to having people reach out to us, not only reach out to us and say they want to collaborate, but that they've thought through an idea, they've built that out in advance, and they're like pitching us. I mean, I would be lying if I didn't say that was just pretty cool, that the people that I follow as these people that I look up to within marketing are now reaching out to us with their shows. So that's been very exciting. But aside from that, like when you talk to Corrina for this first conversation, maybe she has an idea, but you can't say like, so what's the Corrina brand visually? It doesn't exist.
Yeah, she didn't know. And then also you're folding in Taylor's perspective too. It's like we have two different individuals, right? I'm not sure they talk too much about like, hey, how will this show look and feel? So you're trying to go through that process early on and figure that out. But typically when we develop a show, when we're working with a client, we have like this spectrum of options that we typically put in front of them. One option is you name the show right after your company name. And it's very much on the nose. And that shares all the brand elements of the company. On the opposite side of that, you do a standalone brand that's completely disconnected from the company. That takes a lot more work. It's a lot more involved because you're not tied to anything. There are no guardrails in place for you to work from. And then we have shows that typically with our clients fall in the middle, where we're borrowing elements from their brand, but we have a little bit of freedom with maybe typography or something like that. But with the shows that we produce in our network, we are very much on that side where we're not tied to anything. There aren't any guardrails. And sometimes that makes creative projects a little bit more challenging. So one of the things that I did want to do for this show was to really wrestle a little bit with Midjourney and to figure out how can we use that for brainstorming and art direction. And we went that route because as we were talking with Corrina and Taylor, we're trying to figure out, all right, so where are we going to start from? Is this going to be something that's illustrated? What's the look and feel? Is it modern? Does it have textures in place? And the one thing that we landed on was that we wanted to convey some level of grit within the design, because back to what we talked about with the theme statement, these are folks that are in the weeds, right? Mm-hmm. They're rolling up their sleeves. So there's kind of like this blue collar nature to it, or it's a little rough around the edges almost, right? Because it takes a lot of work to get this work done. And so we wanted to pull that through the design. And so we used Midjourney in a way to help us describe some of the different designs that we could use. And we went through just a series of steps to get
and
that.
Real fast, for the audience that doesn't know, can you talk a little bit about what Midjourney is and how you leveraged it?
Yeah, it's a generative AI tool that actually you can turn text into image. And so like just by describing a scene or an illustration or a photograph, it'll actually create one based on what you describe. And you can get very detailed or you can be very open-ended. and you can just generate a lot of possibilities. And I think what really worked for us on this show was to just brainstorm very rapidly. And so we did that internally at first, and then we kind of landed on some things and said, hey, let's develop a mood board, which is what we did as the first step to work with Corrina and Taylor. So we had like 3 different types of concepts that we visually represented. And we said, how do these feel to you? Like, what do you like? What do you don't like? And then based on that feedback is what led us to the next steps, really.
And really, the beautiful part about it is when you look at that final product, and I want you to describe how we landed on that as well, because our audience is probably listening to this and saying, "Oh, so you used Midjourney to develop your cover art?" Well, no, not at all. I mean, that went through a rigorous design process, but what we were able to do, and I'll be interested to hear you talk about this as well. What you're able to do when you use a tool like Midjourney during the conceptual phase of trying to establish the creative is you really have the ability to not cripple your internal design team's time, where you say, I want 5 different concepts, and they have to spend days coming up with them. You're able to plug these conceptual ideas into the tool, land on a direction, and then leverage the in-house design team. So talk to me a little bit about that process and where the handover happens from AI generative tool to creative director, designer taking over and making it custom and ours and theirs, and just what went into that process.
Yeah, and it's very much a process that's under development as these new tools come out. I mean, virtually every day. But how we really fitted into this process this time was to really help translate what Corrina and Taylor wanted and some of the information that I gathered, translate that into a visual representation of something. So it was almost an interpreter in some ways. So once we landed on kind of the look and feel, that's then what we took to our designer internally in motion and was like, hey, this is the style and the look and feel that we're going for, but we need to custom develop this. Like when you use Midjourney, all the images are flat. We don't have layers. You can't change and manipulate things yet in Illustrator and Photoshop, but that'll probably happen eventually. But what we were able to do is just get really solid reference material that the hosts were comfortable with, and it provided a direction. And then that allowed us to iterate there. So I think we got to the end state faster, and we got something that they really liked that really tied to the theme statement. So it was a faster process, and it just gave us more optionality, I think, at the end of the day.
For sure. And it also gives autonomy to and this is the second time I'm talking about this, which is just so important in these engagements or in these big initiatives like this. The more autonomy that marketing can have without having to rely on anyone else is huge. Because if you think of, if you had sent off, let's say we don't have an in-house design team and someone's trying to create something that they are very proud of or what have you, or something similar to what we're doing, and they send it away for 3-4 days, 5 days, whatever it may be, to a designer who maybe they don't have in-house. And then those designs come back based on some ideas that you put in text, and you hate them.
Yeah.
Well, then you start back over at square one. You have to give feedback. You have to hope that the next time that they come back, maybe that you don't like at all what they provide the second round. And now you're behind 10, 15, 20 days. And now you have to go find another designer who's going to be able to really hone in on what your vision is. You kind of see it in your head, but you're struggling to articulate it, or maybe this person isn't hearing you. Instead, you can use an AI tool yourself within marketing. You're not a designer by trade and are able to lock in on, hey, this is pretty close. Now hand this over to the designer and say, all right, here's the idea we're going for. Here's some pointers for what we're looking for. Can you really build this out? And that's what happened. And I'd like to think, based on what I saw on social media, that people were really impressed and excited about where the cover art landed. And I know Taylor and Corrina were excited.
Yeah.
They're can we post it? Can we post it? I mean, they were excited about it. I love the way it looks. I showed my wife. She thought it was cool. I mean, everyone I've talked to, and, maybe they're just telling me what I want to hear, but you see it on social. I mean, I really like where it landed. And, it is difficult when you have to start from nothing. And more people we're seeing are doing this influencer marketing play where they're going to have to build things out from scratch. And if they can do it more easily, more lightweight, with autonomy for marketing, people will be able to move faster.
Yeah. And I won't pretend like we have the process figured out, but I would say the best way to categorize like how we used it for this project was almost like a research assistant.
Yeah.
So it's like, hey, go do some research, curate some images. Let's develop some concepts from there. And that just really helped us, speed along the process and made it better at the end of the day, I think. So kind of tie things up here, like what are you looking forward to the most with this show, do you think?
Well, I'm going to give a cookie cutter answer on that. I think the thing that I look forward to the most with all of our shows when they launch is just proving out a consistent model and seeing how they grow. One of the things that I'm most proud of with our shows, our internal shows, is just how long they've been running. We try to set up a really strong foundation for these folks, and then we just get to see them evolve and grow. And we have shows that, every one of our shows in Marketers in Demand has been running for 3 years, 2.5 years, 2 years, going on 30, 50 episodes and things like that. And it's just exciting to see how people evolve and grow. You take Nick Bennett's show that started out as Rep Your Brand. It's a completely different show now that has evolved and grown and, has changed over time into something completely different. Through that work happened with the two of us. We had a podcast and we're like, we don't even like doing this podcast anymore. We don't think it makes sense. So let's change it into this podcast. So a little generic in my answer, just because it's hard to say too much after a show, after one episode. It's almost just like, all right, we got one out and now it's time to just continue to build and refine that foundation. What about you?
Yeah, I think for me, this might even tie into a response that I gave to Corrina, because I know Corrina was like, hey, we just finished our first recording. Well, what'd you all think? And I was like, well, my only feedback is to just continue being direct, which is where the name of the show came from. Like Corrina and Taylor are just very direct in kind of how they ask questions or how they communicate with each other. And I was like, if you can capitalize on that like instinct to where you're asking the detailed questions and you're trying to really uncover how people are doing the real work, I was like, you'll just keep getting, good content with each and every episode. So if we can do that and be consistent, I think we'll be in a good spot.
And it's funny that you say that, because one of the things that I almost refuse to do with clients of Motion, these are people who are launching podcasts at tech companies, is after episode 1, they want feedback on what I thought of their episode. And the only feedback that I give, and I tell them this, the only feedback that I give are things like, visually, did they have, and Rob from On Camera On Brand will appreciate this, but I'm looking at it visually, like, do they have a window? Did it look okay? Is their mic close enough to their mouth? Was their internet speed good? What I try to not do is give too much feedback, because it's episode 1. Yeah. The hardest thing is hitting that record button. And the last thing I want to do is give someone 10 things to think about after they did one episode. After episode 5, 10, maybe, at that point, I'm like, okay, now I can give you some feedback. Yep. We can go through, maybe you can refine this with your question asking, but it's the last thing that I want to do after someone does episode 1. So I appreciate that you said that. And that was the feedback that you gave them. It's right in line with how I kind of would have responded. Yeah. So with that, we're coming up on time here. I'll kick it to you for where people can go to find this show, and listen to new episodes and what have you.
Yeah, the best place, we have motionagency.io/direct. They can get all the latest episodes there. And then probably the best place is to follow Corrina and Taylor on LinkedIn. So they'll be releasing every episode, the promo video that we create, and then they'll be talking about a lot of the experiences that they've had throughout the show as well.
Awesome. So, Tristan, that was fun.
Yeah.
Hopefully
thanks
we'll
for
do
joining me.
Yeah.
I'm glad I could join you.
And that's a wrap for this episode of Recorded Content. This show is produced by Motion, a full-service podcast agency that's all about working with B2B marketers. Starting a podcast is hard, but it doesn't have to be. Visit motionagency.io and get everything you need to launch and grow your customers' favorite show.